So, was Adolf Hitler a military genius? Some kind of brilliant strategist who almost conquered all of Europe? Well, that's the myth. But the reality? Oh, the reality is a much more fascinating and, frankly, catastrophic story. It's about a prideful amateur whose massive blunders, not his brilliance, led Germany to absolute ruin. And to really get how this myth even started, you gotta look at the man himself.
And what better place to start than with his own words? Because this quote, it just perfectly captures his incredible self-confidence. Here's a man with zero formal military training who had never commanded anything bigger than a company, yet he was just convinced his gut feeling, his instinct, was way superior to the combined experience of his entire general staff.
All right, so let's set the scene. It's late 1939. Hitler calls in about 200 of his top generals, and the order he gives them, it is absolutely shocking. Attack France and Great Britain now. To these professional military men, this wasn't just reckless, it was flat-out suicidal. And you can see exactly why they felt that way right here. Just look at the sheer imbalance of power. The Allies could bring up to 8 million soldiers to the fight, against Germany's 3 million. France, by itself, had what was considered the biggest army in Europe. So the German high command is looking at these numbers and thinking, there's no way. But Hitler? He just waved it all away.
And this right here, this is the core of the whole problem. He truly believed his generals were stuck in the mud of old-school thinking. He thought that he, the outsider, could see the simple, direct path to victory. He was sure his willpower alone was the ultimate weapon. But it turns out, the brilliant plan that actually won the day, yeah, it wasn't his at all.
And here's the kicker. The so-called stroke of genius actually came from a true professional, General Erich von Manstein. He came up with this incredibly bold plan to punch right through the Ardennes forest, a place the Allies were sure was impassable for tanks. It was a strategy built on surprise, audacity, and a deep understanding of military history. All the stuff Hitler just didn't have.
And boy, did this plan work. I mean, it worked better than anyone could have possibly imagined. But as France collapsed, Hitler immediately starts to rewrite the story, claiming this incredible victory was all thanks to his own personal genius. Just look at this timeline. It gives you a sense of the insane speed of this thing. The German panzers weren't just moving, they were a blur. This whole idea of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, just completely stunned the world. The Allied commanders were totally caught off guard. They thought the main German attack had to be a diversion. 4 days. Just think about that. 4 days. That's all it took for General Heinz Guderian's tanks to grab an objective that should have taken weeks. His men were literally improvising, charging up hills, creating a level of chaos the French army had never seen. But just when total victory seemed certain, our amateur strategist makes his first huge mistake.
Okay, so you've got 300,000 Allied soldiers with their backs to the sea at Dunkirk. The war could have ended right there. And what does Hitler do? He hesitates. He gets worried about a counterattack on his precious tanks, so he orders them to stop. He hands the job of finishing them off to his Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and they just couldn't pull it off. That hesitation allowed the heart of the British Army to slip away. But you know what? That massive blunder, it got swept under the rug, fast. Back in Berlin, the propaganda machine went into hyperdrive. Hermann Goering is out there saying, Hitler's genius started a revolution in warfare. And what about General von Manstein, the guy who actually wrote the plan? Not a peep. Hitler never, ever admitted the winning idea wasn't his.
So now, Hitler is basically high on his own supply, right? He's completely convinced he's the greatest military mind in history. And fueled by this stolen victory, he makes his most fatal decision. He turns his gaze east. I mean, just look at the difference here. The sheer scale of this new gamble is mind-boggling. The Soviet Union was 26 times bigger than France and Belgium combined. This wasn't going to be another quick blitzkrieg against a small contained enemy. This was a whole different ballgame.
And yet, faced with this monumental task, what was his take on it? Child's play. He actually said that. He completely underestimated the Red Army, and he was sure the Soviet government would just collapse at the first push. It was an absolutely fatal mistake, born from pure, uncut hubris. And so it begins. Operation Barbarossa is unleashed. It was, at the time, the largest invasion force in all of human history. And the first few weeks were devastating. The Germans just ripped through Soviet territory. And for a minute there, it really looked like he might actually pull it off.
But the Eastern Front,
It's a different beast. The enormous distances, the brutal Russian winter, and an enemy that just refused to break. All of it started to expose the huge flaws in Hitler's strategy. This is where the myth of his genius would die a very cold, very brutal death.
And the mistakes just start piling up, one after another. At Leningrad, he pulls away troops for a pointless siege, just to starve a city. Then, as his army gets close to Moscow, he ignores his generals, delays the attack, and his army literally gets frozen in its tracks. And then, Stalingrad, the big one. He splits his army to chase two different objectives at once, a classic rookie mistake that proves fatal.
And this number, this says it all. The surrender of the entire Sixth Army wasn't just a defeat. It was an absolute catastrophe. It was the turning point of the war in the East. It shattered the idea that the German army was invincible, and for the first time, people back in Germany started to have serious doubts about their Führer.
So, how did Hitler react? Did he learn from his mistakes? Nope. He did the exact opposite. First, he blames his incompetent generals for everything. Then, he just starts firing people. 35 senior commanders, including Guderian, the hero from the invasion of France. And then, in the most incredible display of ego, he makes himself the sole commander-in-chief. The amateur wasn't just advising anymore, he was running the whole show.
And from here on out, it's just a downward spiral. We see the collapse of the German war machine, and at the same time, the collapse of the man in charge of it. His world is literally catching fire, and the man himself is falling apart.
You know that image of the iron-willed Führer? Well, the reality was a total wreck. He couldn't sleep, he was hooked on tranquilizers, his body was giving out, that famous tremor in his left hand started, and after the assassination attempt in 1944, his paranoia about his own generals just went into overdrive.
And his last big move on the battlefield? It's almost sad, really. It was his delusional attempt to relive his glory days. He throws a Hail Mary pass right through the Ardennes, the exact spot where he thought his genius was born. But the so-called intuition he had in 1940 was long gone. The whole thing was a complete failure that just wasted the last of Germany's reserves.
This chart, right here, man, it tells the whole story. The difference between the German army of 1940 and 1945 is just staggering. You go from this supremely confident army, led by professionals with the best gear, to this, a hollowed-out shell, running out of fuel, with troops deserting, all under the direct, chaotic command of one failing man.
And even at the very end, picture this, he's in his bunker, Berlin is collapsing around him, and even then he refuses to take any responsibility. In his final will, he doesn't accept a single shred of blame for the disaster he caused, instead blaming the entire war on his ideological enemies.
Which leaves us with this final big question. So was this all just about one man's pride, a war leader so blinded by his own ego that he destroyed everything? Or was this disaster baked into the system from the start? Was an amateur who gambled with millions of lives the inevitable result of an ideology that valued blind faith over actual expertise and raw, fanatical will over, reality itself?